Okay, all right, well, I think we're going to kick this event off now. So thanks for coming along. I'm going to talk about how to build a scenario in clinFHIR. But before I start, I just want to correct some fake news that's been promulgated around. And that is that due to my incompetence, I mucked up the flights from New Zealand to Auckland and flew in here this morning. Now, whilst it is true that I did fly in here this morning, what people don't realise is that there was a disturbance in the space-time continuum which occurred a couple of days ago, and that's the reason why I was late. So I just wanted to clarify that point. So there are actually a couple of sessions that I'm going to talk about, one today and one tomorrow. So the one today, I'm going to talk about the overall process of building a scenario. I'm going to talk about some of the key elements of FHIR that you really need to be aware of if you're going to be doing this kind of stuff. And we'll go through a number of the models that we can create as part of that process. Tomorrow we'll have another session and we'll talk a bit more about structured and coded data, and we'll talk a little about how we create and view some of the FHIR conformance resources. There are actually a couple of sessions today. This one is substantially going to be a presentation, and I'm going to go in and out of clinFHIR as I can, but I've only got 40 minutes, so I won't be able to spend a lot of time on that. After this session, I'll be in the opera room, down from there, and we can go into more detail of clinFHIR if you want to. So, what this is all about is that one of the things that I firmly believe is that what FHIR does is FHIR makes it easier for clinicians to become involved in the development of interoperability projects. I think by making it easier for clinical folk to understand, you're going to get a much better result out of projects because the business experts can be part of the whole process. And as part of that, we've come up with this process for how it would work. And I need to emphasise this is not an official FHIR process or anything like that. It's something which a colleague of mine and myself have been working on as being a way to, as I say, a way to make it easier for clinicians to become involved. And we see a number of steps. And this slide really talks to what those steps are. So in the middle of the slide there, you see the main steps. First is to define what the clinical problem is that you are trying to solve. Next is to create an information model, which represents the actual data that you wish to share. Next is a resources model, which is where you start to take the information and you put it into true FHIR speak. Then we have a references graph, which starts to explore the relationships between the different resources. And then finally we move on to the actual formal FHIR resources themselves. And what the arrows above and below the line are intending to illustrate is that if you look at the clinician and the business analyst, they have a deep involvement in this process early on, and then a lesser part of the process as time goes on. Whereas for the FHIR expert, it's the other way around. They don't really need to be involved up front, but they do need to be involved as the process progresses and as we start to identify the resources to the other artifacts that we actually need. Now I gather that people at the back can't see the bottom parts of the slide, so I'll try and talk to what they actually are. Incidentally, if anyone has any questions at all during the talk, there's some out and I'll attempt to answer them as best as I can. Before we get into that, I just want to review some of the basics of FHIR. A quick show of hands, who here is relatively new to FHIR? A reasonable number, good, okay. And did you go to the introduction session this morning? Good. So hopefully what I'm going to show is we're just going to reinforce some of the things that were spoken about there. And they're really the things that I think a clinical person needs to know for them to be effective in this process. The first part, of course, is the concept of resources, the atomic parts of FHIR, the bits that we actually exchange. And in the slide, this gives some of the resources that are defined. There's about 120 or so all up, I believe, at the moment. These are some of the clinical ones. And a couple of points I like to make in showing this slide. The first is that the resources have got a name that makes sense. So if you look at a resource that says procedure, you can be fairly sure what it's actually trying to represent. And equally, if you are looking for a resource for a particular purpose, such as a medication request or immunisation or a goal, it's fairly obvious as to which resource you should be using. And this is really all part of how FHIR is easy for sort of non-experts to become involved. And by non-experts, I mean people who aren't experts in the clinical domain as well as people who aren't experts in the technical domain. So it's easy for a clinician, for example, to figure out what resource they should be used. This slide, and I wouldn't mind betting, although I didn't see it of course, that this one was shown this morning as well because it's one that we use quite frequently. This really talks to the main parts of a resource. And there are really 4 parts that any resource will actually have. And the first bit, the bit at the top there, is the metadata, if you like, the ID, which is kind of like a primary key of the resource. It identifies it. Things like when it was last updated, security information can go on there and such like. The second part is the text. And any resource can and indeed should have a textual component. Very, very similar to CDA. And for those who are familiar with CDA, they'll be familiar with this idea of progressive interoperability. We're not really sort of definitive about what should be in text, other than to say that it should be clinically safe to render the text without having to render the structured data. The third part that you can see in a resource is that extension element. And extensions are a fundamental part of FHIR. As we are developing FHIRs, we are developing resources, we only put into the core resource the stuff that people are commonly sharing now. We used to call it the rule of 80%. 80% of systems are sharing it, and it can go into the core. The idea is to keep the core as simple as possible, and then to use extensions to add the use case specific parts that you need in your use case. And what this means is that extensions are a normal part of FHIR. And it's really quite important to get that, because people seem to think that an extension means that something's failed. It's not. Any real-time interoperability project will have extensions. And notice how the extension has got a URL. And that URL points to its definition. Again, a core part of FHIR is to say that if you receive a resource which has an extension you don't understand, you can use that URL to find out what it means. And then the last part of that is the structured data which comes out of the spec. In this case, it's a patient example, and you can see there's an identifier and a name. So those are the 4 main parts of any resource. The next thing I want to talk about is the concept of data types. So each of those elements in the resource is made up of a particular data type. And a data type can be simple, like a string or a date, or it can be complex, like a codable concept or a human name. You don't, as a clinician doing this early stuff, you don't need to know what all the data types are, but there are a few that are useful to know. A string is one, that's just a bit of text. A date is another. A quantity, when you're referring to an amount of something. And the codable concept, which is how you represent coded data in FHIR, for example, from SNOMED. So understanding that you have resources, those resources are made up of data types, is important. Then there is the concept of references between resources. So a single resource on its own doesn't really tell you a heck of a lot. It's when you link them together like Lego blocks that you get a more detailed clinical picture. So in this slide we've got a procedure, and the procedure has got as its subject patient. There is a report out to the right-hand side, which is the diagnostic report and so forth. So again, key concept is this issue of resources referencing each other in a graph to be able to tell a clinical story. And this is just an example. I'll flip past this one fairly quickly in the interest of time. But this is showing a consultation here in textual format. It's a boy who comes in with pain in the right ear, elevated temperature, otitis media, given antibiotics. Comes back a couple of days later with a rash. An allergy is diagnosed and the antibiotics are changed. So that's a not uncommon clinical story. And what we've done in this slide is to colour code each of the textual items to indicate which resource would be used to actually represent that particular bit of data. And you can see the colour code down the right-hand side there. And then if we take that and we turn it into our linked, our referenced resources, you get a picture that looks kind of like this. And what you now see is you see the individual resources. So there's an encounter over there on the left. Then there's a condition, payment right here, some observations and so forth. And they are the individual bits of information that are taken out of that clinical story and linked together to be able to tell that picture in FHIR speak. Now, we haven't shown all of the references there. They can be quite complicated, but hopefully you get the idea of how that works. And part of what the clinFHIR tooling will do, as I'll show you shortly, is it allows you to create these kind of graphs yourself for your clinical story. And then this is the last sort of background bit of information I'm going to talk about, and that's the concept of exchange paradigms. So when we're talking about interoperability in FHIR, we think of 4 different paradigms. We think of the RESTful paradigm, which is sort of real-time interoperability, fairly simple, update, create, delete, and so forth. The RESTful paradigm is the one that's best developed in FHIR. In fact, really part of the reason why FHIR took off so explosively was because it had an answer for this RESTful paradigm which we really didn't have before. Then there's the document paradigm, and this is one that clinicians will be very familiar with, the concept of a discharge summary or an e-referral or a progress note. Then there is the message paradigm, which is sort of like a background exchange of data, ADT message in the hospital, patient's admitted, message goes to the radiology system saying, hey, DevDays been admitted, you might be next for that at some point in time. And then finally the services paradigm, which is another real-time paradigm, and we use that when we want to hide complex stuff behind a simple interface. Good examples of that are in the terminology domain, where there are some very complex terminology operations that you can invoke through very simple interfaces. And indeed, clinFHIR does do that as well, and hopefully we'll see some of that today as well. And in the example today, we are going to be using the document paradigm. You don't have to, of course, but it's convenient because it's one that clinicians do understand. So now I'm going to talk about the clinical problem. And as you can see, that's the first part of this step in this process. And I'm going to talk about a discharge summary. Now, hands up, who knows what a discharge summary is? Excellent, about half. So discharge summary is a summary of what happens to a patient inside generally a hospitalisation of some sort. We use it in the transfer of care when that patient is discharged from the hospital to the care of their usual GP or ambulatory physician in the US. It's a document paradigm, which means that it's something which is part of the clinical record. It's something which is intended to be kept for the long term. And it's the equivalent of the CDA. And a discharge summary or a document in general is made up of a couple of main parts. There's the header type information, which is where you see the patient, the author, details of the admission, which hospital they went into, and so forth. And then there are various sections inside that document which deals with the actual clinical information that you want to represent. They'd be things like the medications on admission, any allergies, the reason for admission, and so on and so forth. So if we think about an electronic discharge summary and how we're going to model it in FHIR, this is the data flow that we might have. So down the bottom there, which of course some of you can't see, is the clinician who's created the discharge summary. And that discharge summary in this particular example is being placed up into some shared data storage of some sort where it can be accessed by other systems. Now, this won't always be the way that it works. In many jurisdictions, the discharge summary is sent from one person directly to another person. But fundamentally, it doesn't actually matter. The bit that we are concerning ourselves with here is the discharge summary itself, what's inside that discharge summary. So we're going to start we've got our clinical problem now, we've stated what we're going to do. We're now going to do an information model. So what is an information model? The way we are using it in this scenario is it's the information that you want to share in clinician speak. So it's the actual data that the clinician feels needs to be shared. It's a form of a logical model in the sense that what's in it doesn't depend on any particular underlying storage or representation or anything like that. It's kind of like a free flow thing. You sit down and you say, hey, this is the data that I want to be able to share. There are many different ways that you could actually create an information model. Obviously, FHIR is one of them, and that's the one we're talking about today. But there are others. OpenEHR is one that's commonly used, particularly in the UK, to represent this clinical data. SIMI is another option that exists. ISO 13606 is another one. So there's different ways of actually doing this. But we're going to talk about how it could be done in FHIR. Which leads us on to clinFHIR. So clinFHIR is a tool. It's been around for about 2 years, 2 and a bit years or so. It was developed initially as a development and a training tool at HL7 working group meetings. And what we found a couple of years ago was that the techies got on board with FHIR pretty quickly because it spoke to some of the issues and problems that they were dealing with. It used technology that they're familiar with. It was easy to use. But the clinicians, whilst they were interested, had a harder time getting their heads around exactly what this FHIR thing was all about. So we've been developing clinFHIR over the past, as I say, couple of years in conjunction with a number of the clinical folk at the working group meetings and more widely outside. In fact, actually, show of hands, who already knows clinFHIR? Okay, not everyone, that's good. Be new for somebody. It's an evolving thing. And by evolving, what I mean is it changes. It changes quite a lot. So what I show you today may not be what it looks like tomorrow. In fact, actually tomorrow's pretty safe because I got to sleep tonight because of that problem with the space-time continuum thing. But it can change pretty rapidly after that. It's got a number of different functions. The sort of things that you can use it to do is to view clinical data or patient data against a FHIR server. I'm not going to show you that today, but it's on there. You can go and have a look if you want to. The logical modeler is the tool that we're going to have a look at today, and then we use that obviously to build the models. The scenario builder is the place where you can start to link together real instances of resources to tell your clinical story. So you saw that picture of the boy with the sore ear. So the scenario builder lets you build those things on your own scenarios. And then the value set editor, extension definition editor, implementation guide viewer are other tools for specialist purposes. One of the things about clinFHIR, if you go in and use it, it's open source, it's available on the web, use it any time, there's no cost or anything like that. And by the way, it is an open thing, don't ever put real data in there. Whatever you do, it's for test data only. But we have the concept of server roles. The reason why I point this out is because you do need to make sure that you've selected your roles correctly. We have 3 roles. The first one is the patient role, that's where the patient data actually sits. The second is the conformance role, and that's where things like structure definitions and profiles and extension definitions and all those things sit. And then finally the terminology role is the one that does the terminology operations. I can't overemphasize how important terminology is in interoperability. I'm not really talking about that much in these sessions, but be aware that it's something which is really important to be aware of. And so now I'm going to go into clinFHIR and just give you a quick look through an information model. Now, this was working perfectly this morning. A quarter of an hour ago, the internet slowed down and stopped working, so I'm going to hope that I'm not going to have that the gods of demos are not going to cause me troubles today. So this is, actually I should go to the real one, shouldn't I? So it's at clinFHIR.com. Okay, and I'll just make that a bit larger. Is that big enough at the back of the room to get a feel for what it is? So this is the front page, Down the side here are the various modules which are in the system. As I said, the patient viewer, server query lets you run queries against it. Scenario builder and logical model are the two that we're going to be talking about in these sessions. Over on the right-hand side here is where you set your servers. I use the public happy STU3 server by default, and indeed if you start up an instance of clinFHIR, it will default to that server. You can change it to other ones if you want to by clicking on the button, and you'll then get a list of various servers that you can select. And I'll just cancel that there. Down here are various links to things. There's the link to the specification there, link to various blogs, of which mine's one of them, various videos and such like. These links down here point to how-to guides. So we've got a series of exercises for you to do if you feel inclined. On the exercises you will see links to these kind of how-to guides as well. So if you don't follow what I'm doing at the moment, those guides will help you out. To go into the logical modeler, you click on the button that says logical modeler. It opens it up. Notice it's opening it up in a new window there. And again, I'll just make it slightly larger. Now, I prepared a logical model ahead of time. As I said, I don't know I'm going to have enough time to go in a lot of detail right now. Next session we certainly can. This is the model that I've created for EDS. As you can see, it's a fairly simple one. The model itself has got a number of components. Over here is where you select the model or create a new one. Various display formats here. This is the designer view where you can make modifications. The mind map is where you present it in a sort of mind mapping kind of view, tabular format and so forth. When you select an element like so, you get a description of it over down through here. It's a tree type thing, so you can add new elements like so. So in this I said I want a date admitted, date discharge, discharge diagnosis. I want to know the patient, of course. To add a new element, you select the parent where you want to add it, click the Add Element button, give it a name, so I'm going to say it's the consultant. The data type, if you happen to know what it is, if you're not sure, just put it in a string. Remember that what you're doing in an information model is you're simply putting down the information from the clinician's perspective. It's not expected that you know what the FHIR bits are. This is about capturing the data in one place. How many times it can appear, and so forth. And then you save that, and then there's the model down through there. And really, that's all it is. You just go through adding into this model the bits of information that you want to capture. You can move things up and down in the tree if you want to, like so, and so forth. So that's what the model, that's what the logical model actually is, or the information model actually is. So I'm going to return. Any questions on that at the moment? Okay. I'm going to return to my presentation. Okay, so, sorry, that's a bit loud. One thing I should have pointed out and didn't is that you do need to log in, and you do that using this guy right here. I've already logged in as me. You'll need an email and password. Use whatever you like. I don't use it for any purposes other than tracking who's doing what in terms of models. Promise there's no spam, won't sell it to anybody, anything like that. It's completely safe, you can trust me. So that's the information model. The next step in this process is the resources model. So this is the step where we start to get more deeply into the FHIR. So the information model didn't really need any knowledge of FHIR. The resources model does. So in the resources model, what someone is doing, and this is where the FHIR expert comes in, is they're sitting down with the information model and saying, right, here's the bits of information that need to be shared, where do they fit in resources? Which resources do we need to select for these bits of information? So you need to have FHIR knowledge and use the same modelling tool to create it. And let me just show you how that's done. So if we go back to clinFHIR here, back to our logical model, and I, again, have created one ahead of time, which I've called EDS resource. Yeah, I'll not bother about changes. So this is representing very similar information, but it's in a different format. So when I created this model, I actually indicated that it was going to be a document. It's based on the composition. And I've divided it up a little bit. So I've said that there's some metadata in here, there's the demographics, and if you look over here, what I've actually said is that the demographics is going to be represented by a patient resource. And then I've gone to medications on admission, and I've indicated that that's going to be represented by a list resource. Now if I go into my list like so, I said the list is going to be made up of medications, which is represented by a medication statement resource. And what I can do if I want to is I can indicate against each resource which are the individual elements which I need to actually represent. So I've got name, gender and phone here, but I could go in here and say, well, you know, the clinician when they created an information model also wanted the date of birth. So I'll add an element here. I could just type in date of birth, or I could be a little bit smarter, and because I said that this thing was actually a patient, the tooling knows what are the available elements for patients, and it can present them to you in a list. So I can just type in something like birthday, and then it will do it all for me. So I'm indicating here that for this particular use case, I'm going to need a patient, and for the patient, I'm going to need the birth date. And that kind of works throughout the whole model. When you create an element, you can indicate which resource it belongs to, which means that when you add children to that element, it can work out what are the possible elements to use and so forth. You do the same sort of thing with extensions as well, by the way, although I'll give an example of that. And then once you've done that, again, because we're under the hood here, what we're actually doing is we're using a structure definition resource. So we're using the FHIR infrastructure. It's actually exactly the same infrastructure that the FHIR spec is built upon to represent this stuff. And that means we can represent it in different ways. So if we now go into our mind map, we now see that the mind map is starting to look a little bit like a reference graph. It's starting to indicate that we've got our EDS here, we've got a patient, which is representing the demographics, there's an encounter resource, there's the list and so on and so forth. So this part here is, if you like, the transition between the clinician, who doesn't really know what FHIR is, and the FHIR expert indicating how to represent that data. And again, we've got other options. We can do this in a table view like so. We can pull out the coded information. And that's also kind of useful because a lot of data in FHIR is and should be coded. But coded data, and we'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow, coded data is a lot more useful in terms of sharing, in terms of understanding the semantic interoperability you might have heard of. So by coding it in this way, it highlights which are the elements that are going to need a value set of some sort associated with them. So there can then be a conversation between the FHIR expert and the clinician as to where to get that value set and what should be in that value set. Again, we've got the references and other displays down there through there. So that's creating what we're calling the resource model. And that's the demo that I've done there. Okay, so we started with an information model, which just represented the data we wanted to share. We've generated a resource model, which has identified the particular resources that we're going to need. What we'll now move on to is figuring out how they link together, how they actually connect. And we do that using a resources graph. And the resources graph shows these linkages together graphically. It uses the scenario builder tool. This is something that you don't really need to have a lot of FHIR knowledge to use. But you do need to either have that resources model that got built for you, or you need to be able to choose the resources yourself. And you can also use it to add data to the actual instances if you want to see, make sure that these resources are going to meet your clinical needs. So we're going to go back to clinFHIR. Go to there and close that guy down. So we've done our two models. This is where you find the scenario builder here. So in the scenario builder, I'm going to create a new scenario. And I'm going to call it DevDays. I'll leave the others as blank. So what we now do is we now start adding resources to our graph by clicking the Add Resource button. Select the resource type. I'm going to start with the patient. Give the patient a name. And they've now been added to our graph. So we now have a graph which has one resource in it, which is a patient. Now I find that the most useful tab to use is this graph tab. And so we see we now have a very exciting graph with a patient in it. So we'll start to add things to it. So I'm going to start with the medication list. So if you remember in the resources graph, we identified that the medication list was a list resource, and the list resource in turn pointed to medication statement resources. So if we now go and we add resource again, this time we'll choose a list. Like so, I'll call it the med list. This is the text element that we're entering in through here. Click on add. So now we get the list resource coming up. Notice, by the way, I didn't point this out with the patient. What the tool does is it goes away to one of the reference servers, the performance server as it turns out, and it pulls down the definition of this resource, which is how it's able to tell you what are the structured items in it. And notice also that what it's done is it's linked linked the list here up to the patient, because it knows that a list resource has generally got a reference to a patient. If it can find a patient, then it will add it into the add that link into there. So we're starting to build our graph. I'll add a new resource there. I'll add a medication statement. Like so. I'll say it's a atenolol, 50 milligrams. And again, we've now got our medication statement that's been added, and again, it's linked it up to the patient, which is what what happened, because that's the medication statement for that patient. What it hasn't done is it hasn't linked it up to the list. So to do that linkage, we select the list resource. This is where you do need to know a little bit about FHIR, because you need to know that the list resource has got an entry element, and the entry element in turn has an item, and it's the item that links to the resource. So if I select that, we now get a definition now, and again, don't have time to go through this in detail, but it will again go out to the spec, it will pull down the details of this particular element, it will give you any text that's in there. But what it will also do, in this particular case, because this is a reference type resource, it goes into the scenario and pulls out all the possible references that you can have. And for a list, it can be anything, so it shows all of the references here. To establish the relationship, you just click on the plus button, like so, and there you go. So we have now got a list, and the list has as its subject a patient, and the list has got a single element in it, which is a medication statement, where the medication statement itself also comes back to the patient. So this is a really nice way of graphically building those relationships, and it's a great way to kind of play with FHIR and see how the bits hang together. We can do more with this, but I need to move on. So I shall return. Okay, so we've gone from information model, references model, to resources graph. But this is a discharge summary, it's a document. We need to think about how we're going to represent this in the document. And as I said, it's a document paradigm, a summary at a point in time, part of the record, very common, CCDA. You do need to understand a little bit about how documents are represented in FHIR, and I think there was a talk on in more detail this morning. This will be a very high-level view. You need to know about bundles. Bundles are resources that can hold other resources. We use them for a number of different purposes. In this particular case, we're using it to hold our document, but we could also use it for things like a transaction, for a message, the results of a search, and so on and so forth. And a document is just a bundle. So here's an example of the bundle, which is the yellow outline there. It's the composition resource, which has got the header information for the document, very, very similar to CDA. And again, you can see that we have our composition, which has a subject. The subject has a reference to a patient. There's an author, which is a practitioner, a section to a list, and so on and so forth. So you can see the various parts of the documents and how they link to each other. And it's really important to appreciate that these are exactly the same resources as we're using anywhere else. And just to show you that, and again to come back to the scenario that we had earlier on, which was the boy with the sore ear, we had that textual element, textual data there, and then we had this resources graph here where we had the various references between graphs. To turn it into a document, all you really need to do is to take exactly the same set of reference resources, stick a composition in the top, link up your sections, put it in a bundle, job done. So let's have a little look and see how you would actually do that in clinFHIR. Whoops, dang, I pressed the wrong button. Ooh, this is going to happen. Wait 1 second while I cover hopefully on my. Okay. Here. All right. So here we have the graph that we generated earlier on. If I want to represent this as a document, what I do is I click on my add resource. And now I add a composition. And I call it discharge summary. So, and add it. And if you now see what's happened is there's my composition. The graph starts to get just a little bit messy at times, but there it is there. But notice that we now have a new tab has appeared, which is a document tab. And if we go into that tab here, we can add a section, and I'm going to choose what the section is, which is discharge medications, and I'll save that, and then I'm going to say that the medication list is what I want to put in my medications, and what now happens is there's my graph, and so my graph has now got a reference there, so there's my composition. Our composition has got a reference via a section entry to my list and a subject to the patient, and that's really all there is to it. There are some other views that you've got, for example. So this is a tree view of the document. Shows the composition at the top, and then a patient, and then the various sections, and there's the list, and there's the medication statement. So this is really just showing the document in a slightly different format. And that's all there is to it. Again, as you go through, as you add the various resources and the various references, everything will update itself automatically. And I think I'm running out of time. I'm just about finished anyway, which is pretty good, even though I say so myself. So that's creating a document. So in summary, we've worked pretty quickly through a set of steps which will result in the creation of a discharge summary. If you're interested, there is an exercise that I've created. You can pick it up from here, and you can go through this process yourself. Now, I am sorry that I wasn't here this morning. I'd hoped to give this talk this morning so you could do this afternoon, but circumstances didn't work out. If you do decide that you're going to give this a go, basic terms of getting started, make sure you select your servers, you're happy with your servers. If you're creating a model, make it unique on that server. So use your initials, something like, dhay underscore my model or something like that. Remember to save your models. Wasn't explicit about this, but in the logical modeler you do need to save the models to the server. And then there's the process there in summary. It's given in a bit more detail on the handout sheets. So document what your requirements are, build an information model, build a resources model, create your graph, convert it to a document. Do any or all parts of those as you wish. And that's it. Thank you for listening.